In music theory, a diatonic scale is a heptatonic scale that includes 5 whole steps and 2 half steps in each octave, in which the 2 half steps are separated from each other by either 2 or 3 whole steps, depending on the position in the scale. This pattern ensures that, in a diatonic scale spanning more than one octave, all the half steps are maximally separated from each other. The word diatonic comes from the Greek delta iota alpha tau omicron nu iota kappa omicron sigma, meaning progressing through tones. The 7 pitches of any diatonic scale can be obtained using a chain of 6 perfect fifths. For instance, the 7 natural pitches that form the C major scale can be obtained from a stack of perfect fifths starting from F, F, C, G, D, A, E, B, called Pythagorean tuning. This property of the diatonic scales was historically relevant and possibly contributed to the worldwide diffusion because for centuries it allowed musicians to tune musical instruments easily by ear. Any sequence of 7 successive natural notes such as C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and any transposition thereof, is a diatonic scale. Piano keyboards are designed to play natural notes, and hence diatonic scales, with the white keys. A diatonic scale can be also described as 2 tetrachords separated by a whole tone. The term diatonic originally referred to the diatonic genus, one of the 3 genera of the ancient Greeks. In musical set theory, Alan Forte classifies diatonic scales as set form 7 to 35. This article does not include alternative 7-note diatonic scales such as the harmonic minor of the melodic minor. History. Western harmony from the Renaissance until the late 19th century is based on the diatonic scale and the unique hierarchical relationships, or diatonic functionality, created by this system of organizing 7 notes. The modern major and minor scales are diatonic, as were all of the church modes. What are now called major and minor were in reality, during the medieval and Renaissance periods, only 2 of 8 modes based on the same diatonic notes. Depending on which of the 7 notes is used as the beginning, the positions of the intervals, the half steps, end at different distances from the starting tone, hence obtaining 7 different scales or modes that are, as already mentioned, deduced from the diatonic scale. By the end of the Baroque period, the notion of musical key was established, based on a central triad rather than a central tone. Major and minor scales came to dominate until at least the start of the 20th century, partly because their intervallic patterns are suited to the reinforcement of a central triad. Some church modes survived into the early 18th century, as well as appearing occasionally in classical and 20th century music, and later in modal jazz. Prehistory. There is one claim that a 45,000-year-old Babe flute uses a diatonic scale, but there is no proof or consensus it is even a musical instrument. There is evidence that the Sumerians and Babylonians used some version of the diatonic scale. This derives from surviving inscriptions that contain a tuning system and musical composition. Despite the conjectural nature of reconstructions of the piece known as the Hyacinth songs from the surviving score, the evidence that it used the diatonic scale is much more soundly based. This is because instructions for tuning the scale involve tuning a chain of 6 fifths, so that the corresponding circle of 7 major and minor thirds are all consonant sounding, and this is a recipe for tuning a diatonic scale. 9,000-year-old flutes found in Jiahu, China indicate the evolution, over a period of 1,200 years, of flutes having 4, 5 and 6 holes to having 7 and 8 holes, the latter exhibiting striking similarity to diatonic diatonic whole spacings and sounds. Theory. Using the 12 notes of the chromatic scale, 12 of each of the 3 major scales, 12 of each of the 3 minor scales, and 12 Locrian scales can be played, totaling 84 diatonic scales. The modern musical keyboard, with its black keys grouped in 2s and 3s, is essentially diatonic. This arrangement not only helps musicians to find the bearings on the keyboard, but simplifies the system of key signatures compared with what would be necessary for a continuous alternation of black and white keys. The black keys were an innovation that allows the adjacent positioning of most of the diatonic whole steps, with significant physical and conceptual advantages. Analysis. In music of the broadly Western classical tradition, the pattern of 7 intervals separating the 8 notes of an octave can be represented in 3 ways, which are equivalent to each other. For instance, for a major scale, these intervals are TTS, DTTS, where S means semitone, T means tone, 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1, where 1 means semitone, 2 means tone, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, where half means semitone, whole means tone. Dot. Major scale. The major scale or Ionian scale is one of the diatonic scales. It is made up of 7 distinct notes plus an 8th that duplicates the first an octave higher. The pattern of 7 intervals separating the 8 notes is TTS, TTTS. In solfege, the syllables used to name each degree of the scale up do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do. A sequence of successive natural notes starting from C is an example of major scale, called C major scale. The 8 degrees of the scale are also known by traditional names: first, tonic; second, supertonic; third, mediant; fourth, subdominant; fifth, dominant; sixth, submediant; seventh, leading tone; eighth, tonic. Natural minor scale. For each major scale, there is a corresponding natural minor scale, sometimes called its relative minor. It uses the same sequence of notes as the corresponding major scale, but starts from a different note. Namely, it begins on the 6th degree of the major scale and proceeds step by step to the first octave of the 6th degree. A sequence of successive natural notes starting from A is an example of natural minor scale, called A minor scale. The degrees of the natural minor scale have the same names as those of the major scale, except the 7th degree, which is known as the subtonic because it is a whole step below the tonic. The term leading tone is generally reserved for 7th degrees that are a half step away from the tonic, as is the case in the major scale of the harmonic minor scale. In solfege, the scale degrees are named in 2 different ways, either la, ti, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, or do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, te, do. Besides the natural minor scale, 5 other kinds of modes of scales can be obtained from the notes of a major scale, by simply choosing a different note as the starting note, a tonic. All these scales meet the definition of diatonic scale modes. The whole collection of diatonic scales as defined above can be divided into 7 different modes. As explained above, all major scales use the same interval sequence DTS, DTTS. For the modal point of view, this interval sequence is called the Ionian Mode. It is one of the 7 modern modes. Taking any major scale, a new scale is obtained by taking a different degree of the major scale as the tonic. With this method, from each major scale it is possible to generate 6 other scales modes, each characterized by a different interval sequence. For the sake of simplicity, the examples shown above are formed by natural notes. However, any transposition of each of these scales is a valid example of the corresponding mode. In other words, transposition preserves mode. The whole set of diatonic scales is commonly defined as the set composed of these 7 natural note scales, together with all of the possible transpositions. As discussed elsewhere, different definitions of this set are sometimes adopted in the literature. Diatonic scales and tetrachords. A diatonic scale can be also described as 2 tetrachords separated by a whole tone. For example, under this view the 2 tetrachord structures of C major would be, and the natural minor of A would be. The set of intervals within each tetrachord comprises 2 tones and a semitone. Properties. The diatonic scale as defined above has specific properties that make it unique among 7-note scales. In other words, no other kind of scale has the same properties. It is obtained from a chain of 6 successive perfect fifths. For instance, the 7 natural pitches which form the C major scale can be obtained from a chain of perfect fifths starting from F. It is either a sequence of successive natural notes or a transposition thereof. It can be written using 7 consecutive notes without accidentals on a staff with a conventional key signature, or with no signature. This is because the staff is purposely designed to represent diatonic scales. David Rothenberg conceived of a property of scales he called propriety, and around the same time Gerald Balzano independently came up with the same definition in the more limited context of equal temperaments, calling it coherence. Rothenberg distinguished proper from a slightly stronger characteristic he called strictly proper. In this vocabulary, there are 5 proper 7-note scales in 12 equal temperament. None of these is strictly proper, i.e. coherent in the sense of Balzano, but in any system of mean tone tuning with the 5th flatter than 700 sense, they are strictly proper. The scales of the diatonic, ascending minor, harmonic major, and Locrian major scales, of these, all but the last are well known and constitute the backbone of diatonic practice when taken together. Among these 4 well-known variants of the diatonic scale, the diatonic scale itself has additional properties of what has been called simplicity, because it is produced by iterations of a single generator, the mean tone 5th. The scale, in the vocabulary of R. V. Wilson, who may have been the first to consider the notion, is sometimes called a MOS scale. The diatonic collection contains each interval class a unique number of times. Diatonic set theory describes the following properties, aside from propriety: maximal evenness, Myhill's property; well-formedness, the deep scale property; cardinality equals variety, and structure implies multiplicity. Tuning. In just intonation the diatonic scale is tuned. In Pythagorean tuning the diatonic scale is